Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo is the follow-up to one of the biggest, most influential, and controversial battle shonen released within the last decade. Set 68 years in the future, and focusing on the introduction of aliens to the world of Jujutsu, many fans of the story wondered if this manga would be any good, or whether or not it was even worth the trouble of tuning into. So, a few chapters in, what's the deal with Modulo? Is it any good? Is it worth checking out if you're a fan of the original work? Or is this just another follow-up to a beloved manga that falls short of the original in every way? Today, I'll be giving my thoughts on these discussions circulating around Modulo to answer the question, is Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo even worth it? As I said before, Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo is a sequel series that takes place almost 70 years into the future, with the core premise centering around the existing tensions between Sumerians, the aliens in question, desiring to take refuge and cohabitate with the people of Earth. Tsurugi and Yuka Akotsu, grandchildren of Yuta and Maki, are the protagonists for this story alongside Maru, one of the Sumerians sent to work alongside these Jujutsu sorcerers as an envoy for the aliens. And from this point, Jujutsu hijinks ensue. Based on the premise and the events of the first chapter, many fans of Jujutsu Kaisen proper left it a bit dissatisfied, to say the least. I think partially due to many people's reception to sequel stories like Boruto, the idea of aliens existing in this manga at all had many people on edge, and I myself wasn't exactly moved at the thought, just pretty ambivalent to the whole thing at its core. For the first handful of chapters though, what was more concerning to me than the concepts Gege decided to focus on at a baseline was the fear that the primary characters and motivations wouldn't really be able to get me through the door. Tsurugi and Yuka's primary conflict centering around getting stronger so that, in Yuka's case, she can retrieve Yuta's ring as an heirloom, and in Tsurugi's case, give his younger sister the ring to prove his own worth, wasn't something that conceptually felt very promising. And even still, it's one of the less interesting elements of the narrative. As chapters continue releasing, Gege continues to do a good job of fleshing out Tsurugi in particular, not exactly touching on his relationship with Maki, but taking the time to properly elaborate on what kind of kid Tsurugi really is. This fact is significantly less true in Yuka's case, although being charitable, you can chalk a lot of this up to the back and forth structure that Gege seems to be working on at the moment. Regardless, first impressions were pretty harsh. These two kids are not the characters that people have come to like and care for over the past several years, and them being Yuta and Maki's grandchildren wasn't enough to change that from the outset. A bit of a harsh review of a first chapter to say the least, but somewhat understandable given the context. Now, whether or not you're in the know, you might be curious as to why I and so many other fans of the original series might have been and might still be so scrutinous so early on in the story. I mean, as of the making of this video, the manga hasn't even crossed the 10 chapter threshold, so why so critical? As far as general audiences are concerned, I think this critical response is a mix of anger at how Gege wrote some things pertaining to the end of Jujutsu Kaisen bleeding over, but I also think expectations will naturally be greater when the story in question is made by someone so prolific and honestly iconic in the space. Are these expectations completely fair? It could be debated one way or the other, sure, but the reputation of Gege preceding him definitely does add some level of acclaim that fans expect this story to garner from the outset. Personally though, those two things aren't a very big contributor as to why I'm so willing to dive into analysis and criticisms of the manga. My reason for it is pretty simple. This story is said to only go on for 6 months. Assuming a consistent chapter every week with no need for breaks from Gege or Iwasaki, this means that we'll be getting 24 chapters for the entirety of the manga, or just around 3 volumes when printed. There only being 6 chapters by the time of me recording this means that we're already a quarter of the way through the story, which would be the equivalent of really starting to decide how you feel about Jujutsu Kaisen around the 70 chapter mark. Now in JJK's case, was there a major increase in quality after that chapter with the rest of Hidden Inventory, Shibuya, and the Culling games? Sure. But it's not unheard of to start formulating opinions at this juncture, and wanting to give it a fair shake is why I've waited to talk about it as long as I have. When each chapter represents a much larger piece of the pie, more scrutiny for each piece is warranted, at least as far as I'm concerned. That being said, 6 or maybe 7 chapters into the manga by the time you see this, is Modulo any good? To answer that question sufficiently, I think you gotta start with the base components. One of the big ones that changed being the art, because alongside this being a sequel story, it's also not drawn by Gege. Yuji Iwasaki, author and artist of Cypher Academy, is spearheading this work from an artistic standpoint. And while I'm sure as a fan of Jujutsu Kaisen, I'll always miss much of that uniquely Gege, sketchy, and frenetic artwork, I do have to say that Iwasaki has done a really good job of breathing new life into the story, very much creating a clear delineation between this and what has come before, while still holding on to elements that make it feel Jujutsu Kaisen-esque. While I'm not much of a believer in more refined art being innately better than scratchier and messier work, it shouldn't be discounted just how well Iwasaki's much cleaner art fits with the somewhat futuristic setting of the manga. I will say that I feel like the human designs of characters can be a bit bland in comparison to what I felt for JJK initially, but this is more than made up for by the alien and monster designs in the story. It feels like Gege played a very big part in the design of the Sumerians, and Iwasaki has brought those designs to life excellently. Maru, Cross, and Deborah's depictions in the story thus far are my favorite examples of this. Iwasaki also does a really good job of capturing some of the horror elements sprinkled throughout Jujutsu Kaisen of old. This shot with giant cursed hands grabbing Tsurugi, the digging up of skeletons following a Jujutsu investigation, and the first real encounter with a curse user all were handled in a way that I don't think leaves room for wanting that much more. Even the action, while not quite reminiscent of Gege's best work, isn't too bad, and I do feel like we're bound to get some pretty good stuff as time goes on. Tsurugi and Yuka's fighting styles being so close quarters based allows Iwasaki to shruff their stuff a little bit, and what Maru demonstrated in the most recent chapters while short-lived was pretty damn visually impressive, alongside just being pretty damn impressive. I know in many people's eyes, even fans of the original story, the artistic shoes of Gege aren't that hard to fill, but I've always been a pretty big fan of his work in the visual department, so Iwasaki not making me feel like I'm missing out too much is a feat in itself, and I appreciate that. Beyond the visuals though, latching onto the story has been pretty pleasant actually. In all honesty, the first two chapters aren't really much to speak of even now. I think in terms of establishing character motivations, dynamics, world building, and establishing intrigue, Gege does a fine job. A bit verbose and self-indulgent with long bouts of exposition that are packed with useful and seemingly inane information, but nothing too egregious, just not all that fun. Personally, I felt the pendulum swing a bit though with chapter 3, in which we get a pretty basic and down-to-earth Jujutsu mission following Maru and Tsurugi. Maru's desire to truly establish a neighborly relationship with humanity, and the slow softening of Tsurugi's attitude seems to start here, and it's honestly a great way to lead into what I'd consider the first mini arc up to this point. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 feel like a massive quality jump to me. We get a very down-to-earth, multi-chapter mission that feels reminiscent of classic Jujutsu Kaisen, specifically that Origin of Obedience era. There's a bit of mystery, danger, and fun combat that feels pretty inviting and actively fun to engage with. And on top of that, Gege dangles some more things to be curious about by having Maru pop off with his third eye and potential concept reversing curse technique. This was something that Gege was pretty adept at when penning Jujutsu Kaisen, and it's nice to see that this hasn't changed with Modulo. Simultaneously resolving narratives that he's established, all while setting up more intrigue in a very overt and flashy manner is his bread and butter, even here it seems. Much of what I felt was lacking early on was a sense of purpose for the Sumerians' involvement in the greater narrative, as well as, well, interesting characters. Both of these problems seem to be moving in a positive direction. The fracturing of factions in both humanities and the Sumerians camp, involving whether or not integration or invasion is the way to handle things, has been dangled in front of our faces as a plot point demanding some addressing. Deborah out here basically being able to apply to 1v all of humanity, and Maru and Tsurugi's blossoming friendship is kind of moving me, I won't lie. Maru's just an adorably honest character that'd be pretty hard to dislike, somewhat reminiscent of early Yuji, and Tsurugi growing into his own version of the stoic softy archetype isn't groundbreaking in terms of originality by any means, but it's nice, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit. Before this most recent 3-chapter stint, I felt like I was reading this story because of Jujutsu Kaisen, resting on the laurels of a manga that came and went. Now I feel like I'm reading this manga because of Modulo. I'm curious to see what comes next because this story has properly engaged me, and I'm happy to read it every week from that standpoint. It's far from perfect or an outright great story thus far, but very few manga are at the 6-chapter mark. I look forward to and hope to see Gege's classic exploration of fascinating abilities through the Jujutsu power system. I hope Yuka gets to go on her own run of chapters that makes me as invested in her as I've become in Tsurugi, and I pray that within the limited run promised to us that the Sumerians and the mystery behind them gets pulled back in a fascinating way. But all of these hopes and desires stem from a genuine interest and curiosity in the source material, which is refreshing to say the least. Now, I don't think you should pin all of your hopes and dreams from Jujutsu Kaisen's run onto this manga. Not only is it unrealistic given the stated time constraints, but I also just don't think that's what Gege's intention with this story is. If you're able to tank that truth, I definitely recommend every non-scorned Jujutsu Kaisen fan check this out and see for yourself whether or not it's for you. Now, the greater question of Modulo's overall potential, like whether or not this manga has the ability to be on par with or even surpass Jujutsu Kaisen, is an entirely different story. As far as I'm concerned, the short answer is no. Long answer is it's too short. There's some universe in which this manga runs for a really long time, where I can see Gege learning from his rights and wrongs as a rookie, and without the stressors of drawing each chapter as well, he's able to improve on many of the things we came to dislike about certain writing decisions of his. But this isn't that universe, and this isn't going to be that manga, at least if the 6-month run is to be fully believed, which I see no reason to doubt that. I've read one-shots so good that they surpass fully serialized works plenty of times, so it's not technically impossible, but Modulo is a serialized work as well, and even if the next 18 chapters were the best things Gege ever wrote, I struggle to see it surpassing the overall quality and cohesion of what came before. It's still very much worth a read in my opinion, and a manga that I think could shape up to be a nice 7 to 8 out of 10 experience once it's all said and done. Let me know if you want more Modulo videos as chapters come out, because I do think that there are some very interesting discussions to be had. And if you're reading the series, let me know what your thoughts are on it currently. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.